Welcome to History Uncensored. As always, I am your host, Seth Michaels, and today we will be going on a journey well over 2 hours. I'm not sorry at all. Actually, I am. This episode has been recorded by me about 3 or 4 separate times, and fuck my life. I mean, it's been deleted, it's been corrupted. Spartacus just does not want me to upload it. I don't know what the fuck is going on with it. Nevertheless, I've made it through sick kids, sick me, sick family, sick internet, my internet dying, bringing it back to life, and just in time to share it with you guys, recording the episode 3 times, rewriting it, writing it for a 3rd time. I fucking did it, guys. I'm the master of all things. Bow down to me. Oh, seriously, though. I had to get a job recently, so I'm working on the podcast less because I need to make dollars. The podcast isn't making me any dollars yet. Hopefully it will eventually. Of an interesting note, if you want to support the podcast, if you want to become a sponsor of it, please let me know. I would love to have you, as long as you're not like a child murderer or something like Spartacus. Regardless, here we are. It's done. Spartacus, the Scourge of Rome, the man with the brass balls, whatever you want to say. Thank you for joining me. I love every single one of you guys. And let's get right down to it. Welcome to History Uncensored. Spartacus's story, like everybody else's story, starts in the place that they were born. And Spartacus was born in a place called Thrace. And if you don't know where that is, I forgive you, because Thrace is not a real fucking place anymore. Just as in a lot of cases with these old stories, some of these places have gone through different names, and 2,000 years can be hard on geography. Also, I suck with names, deal with it. Where was it? Thrace. It's kind of to the north and east of what we can think of as traditional Greece. Thrace was very rural during the Roman times and during the 2nd and 3rd century BC. They were Rome's enemies, but that was a long time ago in the story of Spartacus. Our hero, our underdog, was born sometime around 109 BC, when Thrace was firmly under the rule and subjugation of Rome. Interesting cultural note on Thrace, they really like to fuck. Do you know that the Thracians were polygamous? As Menander puts it, all Thracians, especially us and the Getae, are not much abstaining, because no one takes less than 10, 11, 12, and some even more. If one dies, wives that is, if one dies and has only 4 or 5 wives, he's called ill-fated, unhappy, and unmarried. According to Herodotus, virginity among women was not valued, and unmarried Thracian women could have sex with any man they wished to. Also of interesting note, Thracians were often depicted as having red or auburn hair. The gingers of the ancient world. I'm not sure if that makes Spartacus more or less terrifying than what I envisioned him, but from now on, I'm picturing Spartacus with red hair. Absolutely. The Thracians were a warrior people, and they valued bravery in battle, especially on horseback. Talk about Spartacus's horse much later, but cool story, bro. They made excellent light cavalry units, and they were proficient with spears and javelins and such, and a special type of curved sword called the sika. Perhaps it was the early warfare training that brought out what would eventually be Spartacus the gladiator and Spartacus the general. But to be honest, we don't know shit about Spartacus's upbringing. I mean literal dog shit about it. I know fuck all, and I spent a lot of time trying to find out the fuck all. He was born, and then suddenly we pick up his history as an auxiliary unit within the Roman army, most likely fighting Mithridates. Mithridates is important to Spartacus, probably not as like a person or a friend or anything like that, but Mithridates' war on Rome really assisted in making Spartacus's uprising successful and possible. Also, while we're talking about slave revolts, I do want to go over the two that kind of led into the Spartacus slave revolt in 73 BCE. And I'll get back to Spartacus. Just you hold on to your underpants, okay, guys? I want to talk about the important revolt number one in Roman history. It was so important they called it a war. Actual wars. The first Servile War. Or the first Slave War. Or the first Sicilian. You get the fucking idea. Oh, also, I'm going to be swearing a lot in these episodes because this shouldn't have taken me 4 weeks, and I'm fuck all pissed that it has taken me 4 weeks. So deal with it, I guess. The evidence for these first Servile Wars can kind of, as might be expected, stems almost wholly from pro-Roman sources, right? The victors write it, and Romans were really good at writing history that they won. At best, from writers who saw no moral justification in servile revolutions. They didn't see why slaves would want to, I don't know, live a better life. They just right over their heads. But the first two uprisings aren't really studied too much by historians, but they contain some unique features. And the first uprising, its leader, Eunice, was in his way almost as remarkable of a man as Spartacus. A little different, but remarkable. There is some disagreement as to when the rebellion actually broke out. The most likely date is about 135 BCE. Diodorus declares that it was entirely unexpected, a bolt from the blue. But there's a good deal of evidence to suggest that trouble, in the form of guerrilla actions against local levies and stuff, had been brewing for about 3 to 4 years before the revolutionaries showed their hand openly. Publius Laenus, consul in 132, recorded that during his praetorship in Sicily, he had sent back no less than 917 runaway slaves to their masters on the mainland. Which is a little bit out of the ordinary, but not a huge cause of concern for Rome yet. No more likely material for rebellion could be found than such fugitives. Those whom Publius caught can have formed only a fraction of the whole. Sicily at this point was indeed the habitual refuge for all criminals on the run from justice across the water, meaning the mainland of Rome. The sweep which Publius made through the island suggests that he knew there was something in the wind. Among those who reached the island, though, there were almost certainly a number of Jews and Chaldeans evicted by Rome by a praetor's edict during the same year. It also must have been soon after, about 139, that a certain Syrian slave from Apamea, known as Eunice, the Benevolent One, was persuaded to become the figurehead of the rebellion. I doubt he needed much persuasion. Listen to this guy. Eunice belonged to one Antigenes of Anna, who had bought him from an earlier employer named Pytho. The Syrian was widely known in Enna as a magician and a wonder worker. He claimed to have visions of the gods both while asleep and during his waking hours, and to learn the future from their lips. Some of his prophecies came true. Even though the sources do their best to write him off as a complete quack, they grudgingly admit that, he sometimes was right. And because of this, his reputation grew and spread accordingly. His master, far from being angry at the slave's presumption of trying to say, yes, I will be king one day, was amused in a patronizing fashion. He turned the whole thing into a joke and took to producing Eunice at his dinner parties to entertain his guests. On these occasions, he would question the slave concerning his future kingdom and ask him how he would treat those present. Eunice, because he wasn't an idiot, quite equably replied that he would treat the ruling class with moderation, and went into a detailed, colorful forecast of his social and political program. The guests, highly amused at this slave's audacity, rewarded him with choice portions of meat, and they begged him to remember these favors when he should come into his kingdom. It would have been pretty amusing to Eunice to disseminate subversive propaganda and be rewarded for it by his master's guests. Meanwhile, minor campaigns were being conducted against the praetors' local levies, probably well away from the towns. And besides giving the rebels valuable experience, if successful, be scored up as notable victories to boost the underground movement's morale. To Roman praetors themselves, these engagements, though irksome, probably had no more than casual significance, and certainly didn't merit an emergency appeal to Rome. It was in the early spring of about 135 BCE that the plan to capture Enna was carried out. The insurgents had chosen their time well. The new praetor, Plautius Hypatius, had not yet arrived from Rome, where disturbing rumors were already beginning to circulate about Tiberius Gracchus. A large body of Roman troops was held down in Spain, with the siege of Numantia and yet to be concluded. There had been an unusually violent eruption from Mount Etna, with lava, smoke, and ashes spreading wide over the countryside. It was locally believed to portend great events in the immediate future. And this is something that Eunice would have taken full advantage of. He launched his attack at midnight. 400 slaves gathered in a field outside the city, where they bound themselves by solemn oaths and sacrifices and armed themselves as best they could. Then, with Eunice at their head, belching flames and spitting fire out of his face holes, they stormed through Enna, leaving a trail of carnage behind them. The Roman historians give the usual catalog of child murder and rape, which goes against the, Eunice being like, yeah, I'll treat you guys just fine. Don't you worry about it. Hey, Roman elites, this might come a little late to you, but I wanted to let you know that he lied. Soon, the original commandos were joined by other slaves from the town itself and began to turn about for further victims. Their own masters and mistresses were already murdered. Demophilius and Megillus, who had hidden in a country house just outside of town, two prominent figures, were brought back to face a packed mass of slaves assembled in the theater. It seems as though some semblance of democratic procedure were adopted by the rebels. Demophilius was allowed to make a speech in his defense, but two of Eunice's leading colleagues, Hermaeus and Zixus, tired of waiting, just fucking murdered him, without waiting for the people's due verdict. They're probably like, these guys are gonna say let's murder him anyway, so let's just go murder him. The revolt had been a revolution at this point. It's crazy. The Eunice's ragtag army survived its first brushes with the authorities and everything, and these encounters brought the rebels' numbers up to more than 10,000. These were mostly agricultural slaves. We don't know much about these guys, but we do know that they mostly cut off their prisoners' hands. Because you can't do much without hands, and that's pretty fucking brutal. Then again, they were slaves. Most of their lives were probably met out with brutality. Who am I to say that they shouldn't be murdering? Well, you shouldn't murder people. Hard stance. But it's hard for me to imagine as well. Sometimes I get stuck with these quandaries and expressing sympathy or pain. History's both sides of the coin. Slavery blows ass. So does murdering anyone in sight once you achieve freedom. Meanwhile, a second insurrection had broken out in the western part of the island, near Argentinum. Its leader was a Sicilian bandit named Cleon, and Cleon was a douchebag. But he heard news of the capture of Enna, and Cleon, too, rode down at the head of his gang into Argentinum and captured the bitch. Laid waste to the surrounding countryside, Roman officials regarded this as a godsend. It was clear to them. They argued that the two rival slave armies would just, butt-fuck each other out of existence. That didn't happen. A mere word from the distant king Eunice, Antiochus, at this point, King Antiochus, he's full of himself, but from the king, was enough to bring Cleon down, and he came east with his brother Commanus and his 5,000 mountaineers, and they joined Eunice as one of Eunice's most devoted lieutenants. Clearly, Rome wasn't even yet fully alive to the danger. Hypsæus raised a levy of about 8,000 Sicilians and met the rebels in open battle. His men were cut to pieces, mostly because they outnumbered him by a lot. These rebels caused some fucking havoc, raiding cities, murdering, pillaging, raping, all of the normal things you hear about rampaging armies. But the Sicilian coup had wider repercussions. News of the rebels' success had traveled fast. 150 slaves formed a conspiracy in Rome. And most of these were kind of stamped out quick, but still, just outbreak after outbreak happened because of these Sicilian rebels gaining ground and defeating a levy of Rome, so on and so forth. And at this point, Rome, Tiberius Gracchus murdered, and the Council for 132 took on the campaign in Sicily. Eventually was a tough, capable general named Publius Rupilius, who had no love for radicalism. He was, among other things, supposed to have been a tax farmer's clerk. With him as deputy commander went Marcus Perperna, soon to celebrate a crushing victory against another rebel leader. This rebellion just sparked shit all over Rome. To begin with, the two new commanders suffered some reverses, but then they systematically set about reducing the rebel strongholds. And this is something that Spartacus did better, and I'll talk about that shit. First came Tauromenium, which only fell after the most stubborn and protracted siege, during which the slaves were reduced to cannibalism. And even then it was betrayed from the inside by a Syrian named Serpion. Comnenus, Cleon's brother, was captured while trying to escape, probably trying to beg help from Enna and the king. The surrendered garrison were first tortured and then thrown down to their deaths from the battlements. Next, they moved on to Enna. Rupilius tried to extract information from Comnenus, who very courageously committed suicide during interrogation. That would not be me. I'm a little bitch. Then he and Perperna set about starving the garrison out, helping the process forward by some discreet fifth-column work. Cleon, in desperation, attempted a sortie and died. Plague and famine ravaged the remainder, and once again, the town was betrayed. There followed another wholesale massacre, with crucifixions and hangings and chains and all of the very wonderful things. All in all, more than 20,000 rebels, it was estimated, died during the two operations. In essence, the slave war was over. Rupilius followed up his victory with a quick sweep through the island, stamping out pockets of resistance wherever he found them. This done, he turned to problems of administrative reform. To begin with, he called off his mass executions because there weren't enough slaves to keep people happy in Sicily. It's true, Rome was dependent on slaves. So many slaves. Now I want to talk about the Second Servile War. That's right, there was another one. And listen to this quote. At that time, then, they gathered in an assembly, and when the proposal was put before them, they first chose as king one named Salvius, who was reputed to be practiced in divination and a flute player in mystic orgies for women. Dude sounds like a boss. Nevertheless, the second major slave war that afflicted the Roman state was almost a carbon copy of the first. It took place a generation or so after the first one, and it also occurred in Sicily. The sequence of events and the actions of the main protagonists are so reminiscent of the first slave war that some historians have hypothesized that the Greek and Roman historians who told the story of the second war simply copied the narrative of the first. The real differences between the two wars, however, are significant, and the similarities may be explained by imitative behavior the slaves and their repressors had learned from the first war. I was just saying, they learned how to revolt better or something. The main difference between the first and the second slave wars were the causes. A series of events in the year 104 BCE created a recruiting crisis for the Roman army. The need for manpower led to a demand for increased contributions to Roman forces from Rome's allies. When the king of Bithynia protested that he could not provide men on the scale demanded because large numbers of men in his kingdom had been kidnapped and taken into slavery by slave traders, the Roman Senate responded by passing a measure intended to protect people of free status in the provinces of the Roman Empire from being wrongfully detained as slaves. The decree raised expectations of freedom among many of the people already held in slavery. On the island of Sicily, slaves who had a model for resistance in their social memory. The war that broke out in the eastern part of the island, 104 BCE, lasted for 4 years, and once again seems to have succeeded in large part because of Roman inaction. Like the first one, against probably 40 to 70,000 people, they sent a group of 8,000 levies against them. They're like, we'll see how this works. And it didn't work. And that was what Rome did for the first few parts of that war. I mean, 104, the same thing, right? They didn't respond to it the way they needed to. And that's something that happens if you study Roman history again and again and again. Rome didn't like learning from their mistakes quickly. back to the war. The sudden explosion of slave resistance appears to have taken the local landowning elite in Sicily and the Roman authorities by complete surprise. Salvius marched his forces on the city of Morgantina. When he marched on the city, it is unclear from the narrative. Why he did it is unclear, but in the process of the siege, which was unsuccessful, Salvius and his men defeated a force of 10,000 Sicilians and Italian Greeks led by Nerva. Meanwhile, a second revolt started near Segesta, led from the start by Athenian. These rebels briefly besieged Lobaeum and followed a failure there withdrew. But the same thing, right? They, from the first one group attacked one city, another group attacked another one, and then they met up and created one bigger one. But they survived for several years. Like I said, this war lasted 4 years. Rome finally responded, and they assigned Licinius Lucullus to the command against them. And he attacked the rebels in open battle with 16,000 troops, winning comfortably, because they used actual troops. And although he failed to follow up his victory, it was kind of a desire to discredit his successor and prevent prosecution for his actions. Lucullus burned his camp and disbanded his army. And this caused the next praetor, Servilius, to achieve nothing of note in his praetorship, during which time the rebels gained the ascendancy. Finally, Achillas was assigned a consul to the command, and in a single engagement crushed the rebels and killed Athenian, who was by this time king. If that was haphazard, it felt haphazard to me. I'm going to redo that here. Athenian and Salvius were separate rebel leaders. They met up. Salvius was declared king. Eventually, Rome summoned somebody, Licinius Lucullus, to crush them. He beat the rebels, didn't follow up his victory. The rebels reformed. Rome sent another group. Eventually, then, Achillas was assigned to council and to the command, the last person they sent. And then Achillas cleared the province of the pockets of resistance and celebrated with an ovation on his return to Rome. That went much better than whatever I had said before that. Disregard that. Break time, though, guys. Food for thought. Without slaves in Rome and Greece, would those civilizations have accomplished the sweeping reforms to Western society that they did? What would the world look like now if those slave states didn't exist? What about Christianity? For now, we're going to take that break and we're going to pick up with Spartacus' story, pretty much as he becomes a gladiator when he's sold in Rome. Other than that, shit's about to get interesting. Enjoy the 30-second pause. How was your wonderful break, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back. Like I said, we're going to pick up the story back with Spartacus. In a lost work by Varro, a Roman agricultural writer of the 1st century BCE, there was a reference to Spartacus. Although he was an innocent man, Spartacus was condemned to a gladiatorial school. When Spartacus began his revolt, Rome faced major wars at both ends of its empire. As I mentioned before, Mithridates, a king in Asia Minor, or Turkey, had sparked a substantial war against Rome in 88 BCE that had spread to Greece and Thrace and was still going strong after 15 years. He said 73 BCE. Meanwhile, in Spain, the renegade Roman general Spartacus ran a breakaway government whose Roman leaders had the support of a native resistance movement. Finally, at the same time, off the coast of Crete, the Roman navy struggled to catch pirates who were wrecking the sea lanes. We know that Rome eventually defeated all of these challenges, but in 73 BCE, that outcome wasn't fully clear. By exploiting propaganda, Spartacus threatened to widen his base of support. He sounded themes that appealed not only to slaves, but also to Italian nationalists and to supporters of Mithridates. Although his message probably attracted few freemen to his banner, in the end, it was enough to frighten Rome. Spartacus and his rebellion was antiquity's most famous slave revolt, and arguably its largest. It was a revolt that absorbed southern Italy, caught Rome with its pants down, and led to 9 defeats of Roman armies, and kept antiquity's greatest military power at bay for more than 2 years. How was it possible? Why did the rebels do so well for so long? Why did they fail in the end? And how could the world's only superpower have let such a problem persist in its own backyard? The ancient sources describe a man of passion, thirsting for freedom and burning for revenge. Spartacus's actions in the beginning and at the end tell a different story. He was no hothead, but a man of controlled emotions. Spartacus was a politician trying to hold together a coalition that was constantly slipping out of his grasp. Whether by nature or training, Spartacus was a showman. His greatest prop was his own body, but Spartacus used many symbols, from a snake to his horse to form his image. A cult of personality helped attract tens of thousands of followers, but at a price of luring them into the delusion of invincibility. Spartacus's life had unfolded on the broad plains and winding hills of the Balkans, but now his frame of reference was no wider than the walls of Batiatus's establishment, with occasional glimpses of Capua. That's right, we join Spartacus as he is a gladiator in Capua, in the ludus of Batiatus. He was sold in Rome and quickly moved to Capua, where most of Romans' gladiators were kept. The city of Capua and business had much in common. Neither was respectable in Rome's eyes, and both depended on slave labor. Each occasionally offered a ladder of mobility to slaves, but there was one difference outside the house of Batiatus. The ladder sometimes led to freedom, but inside the ludus, it almost certainly led to death. Spartacus had taken a long route to get to Capua. In his native Thrace, young Spartacus had served in an allied unit of the Roman army. The Romans called these units auxia, literally the help, and its men were called auxiliaries. These units were separate from the legions, which were restricted to specifically Roman citizens. Although they weren't legionnaires, auxiliaries got a glimpse of Roman military discipline. Spartacus's later military success against Rome becomes easier to understand if he had seen firsthand how the Roman army worked, and that's how I imagine him. In the auxiliaries, if he was in Thrace and in the auxiliaries, I almost am positive that he would have been some form of light cavalry. Romans were terrible cavalry members. They didn't ride horses well. They made great infantry units because they utilized their materials well, had great armor, a lot of bodies. They were great infantrymen. But cavalrymen, shite. Utter shite. Before Spartacus ever came to the ludus, he was innocent of whatever crime was laid to his feet, and that was directly from Varro. Knowing that he was guiltless would have added flames to the fire of Spartacus's rebellion. Anybody would get upset at being unduly prosecuted. In any case, Spartacus had become the property of Batiatus, or in some texts, Vatia. The next and possibly the last act of the Thracians' life was about to begin. Capua was known for its slaughterhouses, its flowers, and most of all, its gladiators. Lucky, that is, except from the point of its workers. Capua was a large part a city of slaves, both homegrown and imported. Many of the imported slaves were there to become gladiators. It was the heyday of exploitation in ancient Rome. 125 years of Roman expansion and wars after 200 BC had really flooded Italy with unfree labor. It was the zenith of misery and the nadir of freedom. Yet it was also an era of large concentrations of slaves, many of them born free, some of them ex-soldiers, and there was few or no police force. It was the perfect tinderbox to light Spartacus's rebellion. Add to that the freedom given to some slaves to travel and even carry arms. Finally, consider the many possible refugees that were provided by nearby mountains. It's no accident that within the space of 60 years, Sicily and southern Italy would explode into three of history's greatest slave uprisings, and I already talked about the other two. In the countryside, masses of slaves worked on large farms, often in chains, usually locked up for the night in prison-like barracks. Others were employed as herdsmen. They were left to fend for themselves or starve. Meanwhile, in town, slaves worked in every profession, from the shop to the school to the kitchen. In Capua, there were even slaves to collect the 5% tax owed when slaves earned their freedom. A lucky few made it to freedom, and some prospered. Some, astonishingly, went into the slave business, turning their back on their humble origins. But remember, this is Rome. You weren't a true citizen of Rome until you owned a slave. The other thing that I want to mention, we will see this happen again and again and again as I discuss slavery. The further I get into slavery, the more disgusting it becomes. We haven't learned from our mistakes. Over the course of history, we often see ex-slaves become slave owners. I would love to do an episode on just the idea of that. How can one person go, like begets like? I don't know what it is. I'll have to do a bunch of research, but it's just, I have to mention it. It's really interesting. And yet, with all of this happening, by 73 BCE, not Capua, but Rome, the capital, put on Italy's greatest gladiatorial games. Rome's cautious elite refused to allow gladiators to be housed within Roman confines, the city Rome. Violent and dangerous, gladiators would have been foxes in the proverbial Roman henhouse. It was safer to keep them outside the capital. And Capua was ideal, only 130 miles away and connected to Rome by the most famous highway in the world. Capua and Batiatus's ludus, the school, had become home to a hodgepodge of gladiators of differing descent. We have Celts, Germans, Romans, Thracians. Sure, their societies differed, but they had one thing in common. Eventually, they knew how to fight. And I talked about the training that was required of gladiators in the previous 2 episodes. Fighting or becoming a warrior in most of these societies was the highest male calling. These men and women, in most cases, were fucking warriors. They didn't hide from battle. And sometimes they would charge into battle naked and full of alcohol and wine and other good things. The alcohol thing was pretty common before a fight to help steel the nerves and provide a rough barrier from pain and exhaustion. In the Gladiator episode, gladiators sometimes had women that lived in the ludus with them. We did not know if the herald of Dionysus was Spartacus's wife, but we do know, however, that she was of great import to both him as well as Spartacus's revolt. Her words as a herald, a speaker of the gods, a seer, and a woman of wisdom eventually helped Spartacus's revolt just as much, if not more, than his leadership. She, to the best of our knowledge, was also of Thracian descent, somebody that could have shared common ancestry, a common descent with Spartacus. They would have naturally gravitated toward each other in the ludus and the dire circumstances that they shared. Thracians loved 4 things: hunting, drinking, fighting, and fucking. They were born brawlers, and they had a reputation for brutality. Thracian cavalrymen, for example, which I think is what Spartacus was, fought like wild beasts, long kept in cages, then aroused. When they defeated the Romans at a skirmish in Calnisius in 171 BCE, they returned to camp singing and brandishing the severed heads of their enemies on their spears. But let us for a moment step back into the life of the ludus and feel our way for these men and women who were both slaves, people, and gladiators. A new recruit into the ludus took the most sacred oath imaginable, and the most terrible. They swore to be burned, perhaps even tattooed, which was the mark of slavery, chained, beaten, and killed with iron weapons. It was, says the Roman writer Seneca, a promise to die erect and invincible. And perhaps that's more prophecy than fact, because facing death calmly was the height of the gladiatorial art. After this oath-taking, the new gladiator then followed a training schedule that was in its own way as pure and as strict as a Spartan's. But being a gladiator was a special privilege in Roman eyes, and not merely because gladiators were treated better than average slaves, and they were. Not that the Romans were simply just glorious about gladiators. Instead, they considered gladiators to be duplicitous. They considered them to be both good and bad. To be forced to be a gladiator was demeaning. It was a reduction of famia. To volunteer as a gladiator was deprived. To become skilled as a gladiator was dangerous. But to die as a gladiator, to die erect and invincible, was sublime. The Romans, as I have come to realize, were truly fucked in the head. But all of this together was the tumultuous brew that was percolating within the ludus. Men caged like animals, forced to fight for the pleasure of Roman citizens. A reduction of their famia, their pride, a horror for the eyes of men and women alike. I'm sure that men from these great places refused to take this sitting down. They refused to go without a fight. And that is exactly what they would do. Some of Batiatus's slaves might even have liked discipline. They could hardly have minded their rewards, though. Victorious gladiators got glory, cash, celebrity, and even sex, which was better than what other slaves faced, absolutely. Still, 200 gladiators from Batiatus's ludus decided to break out. If it is ironic that they, of all people, should spark a slave uprising, it was typical. Think back through history, privileged slaves have often led the revolts. Maybe because they have high hopes, maybe because they are closer to society. Did gladiators explode because Batiatus tightened the screws? Or perhaps theirs was a revolution of rising expectations. According to one ancient author, the gladiators decided to run a risk for freedom instead of being on display for spectators. It was humiliating to have to fight to the death for the entertainment of a Roman public. A certain greatness of soul runs through the whole story of Spartacus, from Capua to his last battle. And Thracians, Celts, and Germans prided themselves on their contempt for death. They believed in the afterlife, and they preferred to think of themselves as fearless fighters, not cowards. Spartacus had to convince them that there was a better fight waiting for them as fugitives than inside the ludus. Gladiators wanted neither to flee or to free others, but standing and fighting in Italy, killing Romans, stealing their wealth, and attracting supporters from other slave populations, that would have appealed to the men in the ludus. This familia gladiatoria, Batiatus's family of gladiators. It would have appealed to these men, these provokers and dealers of death. In 73 BCE, the story picks up with a Thracian woman announcing a miracle. A prophetess, said to be gorgeous beyond all respite. She preached the word of Dionysus, who took possession of her during ecstatic frenzies. I've come to realize that in the ancient world, if you wanted to get recognized, just say you heard the gods. But this, the god, she said, had bestowed great power on a man. Like her, he was a Thracian who lived in Italy. He was her lover, Spartacus. How Spartacus's consort came to Italy, how she met Spartacus, and whether or not she too was a slave, they're all unclear. It's not certain that she was with Spartacus in Rome, although it seems likely when Spartacus was eventually sold into slavery, but we do know that she cohabitated with Spartacus in Capua. She also fled the city with him, and there's reason to think that the Thracian woman spread Spartacus's fame. Spartacus had gravitas. He had the appeal of a gladiator, showman, but now he had the word of a god on his side. When Spartacus was brought to Rome to be sold into slavery, a remarkable event is supposed to have taken place. Plutarch records the story, but he does not vouch for its veracity. While the Thracian was sleeping, a snake wrapped itself around his face. The Thracian woman interpreted the event as a miracle. Just as a snake had wrapped itself around Spartacus's face, so he too would be surrounded by a great and fearful power. The Thracian woman's words carried the weight of prophecy. Thrace had a long tradition of prophetesses and oracles. Thracians set great store by women's religious authority. So did the ancient Germans, who believed that there was something sacred and prophetic about women. This would have been easier to get the Celts, the Germans, into Spartacus's grasp, make them heed his words. They might not have been there for the god, but they were there for the idea of the man. Anyone can grasp the timeless stereotype of the woman who speaks for natural forces, the siren, the sibyl, or the witch. By associating Spartacus with a snake and a god-given power, this Thracian lady gave him a new identity. She blended old notes of religion, nationalism, and class into a new song of rebellion. The snake made Spartacus a Thracian hero and linked him to Dionysus through this prophetess. To the downtrodden, Dionysus offered hope. To the Roman ruling class, Dionysus spelled trouble. By invoking that name, the Thracian woman stirred a chord among foreign-born gladiators and slaves as well as among the Italians who remembered Mithridates' support during the Social War. Her message was in effect, if you supported Mithridates' revolt against Rome, then support Spartacus. Spartacus's feelings toward Rome and its enemies are likely to have been complex. Possibly pride, rage, and shame are all part of what he may well have felt toward the Roman army, toward the Roman public. Solidarity, suspicion, and opportunism all may have marked his attitudes towards Rome and its enemies. These feelings were contradictory, but Spartacus did not have to be consistent. As soon as the Thracian woman spoke, he had God on her side. By her prophecy, Spartacus's lady gave her man a holy duty. As a servant of Dionysus, Spartacus would be a liberator. He would be no mere theorist of freedom. He would have great and fearful power, just as the snake had wrapped around Spartacus's face. For Thracian, power had a clear definition. A powerful man was a warrior, a hunter, a possessor of many horses and women, the father of many children, a great drinker. In a word, he was the ultimate chief. But enough of that backstory shit. Spartacus had to convince the Germans and the Celts, who probably stuck to their own groups. The Thracian lady would have for sure helped. And as we find out later with Canicus and Crixus, the idiots of Italy, Celtic gladiators were probably a harder sell since they were unmoved by Thrace's national god. But they too had a score to settle with the Romans. They too could see just how rich in loot the land around them was, and they would have appreciated Spartacus's natural authority, either human or divine. They might have agreed to join Spartacus, but it's not likely they agreed to take orders from him. Celts were very sensitive about status, as any people in the ancient world were. At feasts, for example, Celtic men sat according to rank. When the meal was served, the bravest men got the hero's portion of meat. If someone challenged his right to it, then, according to Celtic legend, the two men had to fight to the death. So the Celts did not challenge Spartacus to a duel, but they did choose two leaders of their own, Crixus and Anemaeus. And with insurgencies, formal command structures count less than informal sources of power, charisma, persuasiveness, supporters, and a record of success. All in all, I mentioned 200 men decided to join Spartacus. No small achievement on his part, but most of them never managed to escape. The plot was betrayed. Though the guards, it seems, were well armed and in no short supply, of the 274 gladiators still escaped, along with at least one woman, Spartacus's Thracian companion. And how did they do it? After they escaped their cells, they made their way to the kitchen, which is often a small, dank, dark place. They used kitchen implements to take out the guards, which is ridiculous. Still, the guards seem to have had their hands full with the gladiators left behind, as the rebels were able to stop on the road not far from the ludus. They had come across some carts loaded with gladiatorial weapons headed for a different city. Convenient, that worked out perfectly. The fugitives, this is right after they left Batiatus's ludus. The fugitives got rid of the drivers and helped themselves to the arms. These weren't as battle-worthy as the equipment of Roman legions, but they were a major step up from kitchen utensils. Perhaps Spartacus now found a sicca, the curved Thracian sword that had been denied to him in the arena. According to one ancient source, Spartacus wielded a sicca in his battles. And Spartacus in the gladiatorial arena was said to be a murmillo, which I could imagine would have been just hard on him, because during this time, murmillos had to go against the Thrax, which was a traditionally Thracian type of fighting. So he would have had to have basically been fighting against his own fighting style as a murmillo. As a murmillo, Spartacus was probably also one of the larger gladiators. Spartacus would have been a larger-than-life figure. Romans were generally small, and these Celts, Germans, and Thracians from the countryside were bigger. They didn't have to rely on the state to feed them. They were generally smaller communities. They had more meat in their diets. Their diets were more varied. Same reason as hunter-gatherers were much larger than their more civilized counterparts later on. The gracility that humans eventually took on. Same thing with these Thracians, Celts, and Germans. They were almost larger than life, and Spartacus was that fire to spur them into revolt. Spartacus now has his sick. After Spartacus and the gladiators got their weapons and arms from the carts, they went down the Campanian plain. They kind of went through a neat checkerboard pattern of subdivisions that the Romans imposed on the lands they ruled. They traveled past groves and shrines, inns and fountains, and some of Italy's richest farms, many of them belonging to absentee owners administered by bailiffs and worked by slaves. They passed all of these places on to their next stop, Vesuvius, which would have towered over the surrounding countryside. As they passed these places, they would have picked up many different slaves along the way, and the gladiators set up a maroon community, growing in fame over the next few months. It was a temporary one, but on Vesuvius, they picked a place they couldn't stay long. Today, Vesuvius calls to mind the volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD, but in 73 BCE, the volcano hadn't erupted for centuries. It was an area of fertile volcanic soil, over which towered the mountain Vesuvius. It was probably not long after coming to Vesuvius that the gladiators faced a group of armed men from Capua, chasing the gladiators, and they were outfitted with proper weapons and armor. If Capua was like the city of Rome at the time, its police force would have been tiny, so the armies sent against the gladiators might well have been men that were hired by Batiatus, perhaps veteran Roman soldiers. The gladiators seem to have been unimpressed. They drove off the Capuans and seized their weapons. One ancient writer says the rebels were glad to throw away their gladiatorial weapons at this point because they considered them dishonorable and barbaric. Remember, they hated being a whore to the Roman public. The sources tell us that while they camped on Vesuvius, Spartacus and his men accepted new recruits. Many runaway slaves and certain free men from the fields saw Spartacus' revolt as a place of optimism, a chance for a better life, a chance to get back at the brutality and life of being a slave. One source claims that 10,000 fugitives joined the gladiators on Vesuvius. But running away at this time was risky and the mountain was hard to climb. So instead of 10,000, we can assume that several thousand is a safer estimate. Some of the slaves were probably Thracians or Celts like the gladiators, but they also included more Germans, as well as slaves that worked on the estates that ringed Vesuvius. They were a hardy lot, especially agricultural slaves. Plowmen were ideally strong and tall. Vineyard workers were supposed to be broad, powerfully built, and intelligent. Boys and even young girls looked after farm animals, but only the strongest young men were fit to be herdsmen. These people led cattle and sheep and goats up mountainsides, and it was very difficult work requiring strength, stamina, agility, and speed. Gallic people, Gauls, were considered to be especially good herdsmen, particularly with horses, donkeys, and oxen. You can see that as these slaves joined Spartacus's rebellion, this melting pot of people and ethnicities and different types of workers, you can see how this type of slave revolt eventually succeeded where perhaps others had failed. But one group was conspicuously absent from the list of Spartacus's recruits. That was people from the city, either slave or free. But it seems odd because cities like Pompeii and Nola were nearby. True, city walls made it hard for urban slaves to leave, but that isn't the whole story. Urban slaves, people from the city, were a privileged group who generally enjoyed an easier life than rural slaves. Some of them had a reputation for being soft and lazy. Urban slaves were isolated from their rural counterparts and perhaps even frightened of the rough, tough country folk. We might wonder how many of them would have survived in the Italian outback, or if any of them would have survived in the Italian outback. In short, they may not have even wanted to join Spartacus. If so, it was a sign of things to come. Spartacus's revolt would remain overwhelmingly a revolt of the countryside. Another reason why I think it was so successful. They didn't spread out like the previous revolt. They didn't try and take multiple cities. They moved in, they captured, they conquered, they moved out. Vina Vidi Vici. Their eventual destinations weren't quite clear yet on Vesuvius. Their numbers were growing, and their character was changing. They were becoming an army. It's the only explanation to explain their later victories. They made weapons. Their weapons might have been makeshift. The uniforms were homespun, and their experience was minimal, but they trained. They had to have been. They drilled, and they practiced fighting together. There isn't an ancient source that gives us this directly, but without such groundwork, they could never have displayed the military virtues that they did in the coming months and years. So what the fuck was Rome gonna do about this revolt? They had to do something in the face of such a symbol of rebellion, if only because of the clout of the area's wealthy residents. The rebels spread terror. That's another theme that often shows itself, rears its head through the story of soul and heart, but is this idea of terror and fear. And the rebels, what they spread, it was called terror servilis, the fear of slaves. The gentry, the elite, surely demanded action. Spartacus might have guessed as much, but if he did, he didn't let it stop him. Perhaps it was now that one of the rebels, maybe Spartacus himself, made the brave statement reported by one ancient writer. If they come against us in force, it is better to die by iron than starvation. Again, that idea of standing erect and invincible, and if you die sublimely. Given the big picture, the gladiators' revolt up to this point might have seemed minor. Capua had seen a slave revolt before in 104 BC, one of those revolts that was sparked by the Sicilian ones. But it was crushed by barely the number of troops in a single legion, 4,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, for a total of about 4,400 men. So the obvious policy in 73 BCE, the choice was to send in the praetor, to send in the troops, to send 4,400, and everything should be fine. And they did. They sent in Caius Claudius Glabba, and they chose him to send against Spartacus. Glabber's forces were slightly smaller than the ones sent against the rebels of 104 BCE. These forces had only about 3,000 instead of 4,400. So far as we know, no cavalry. But the first revolt had been led by a Roman citizen, who was a knight, no less, while the latest uprising was the work of barbarians and slaves. Apparently, the Romans felt more confident in 73 BCE than they had in 104. As we know, Romans looked down on slaves. They didn't think of them as people. Their servile nature, said one contemporary, made slaves cruel, greedy, violent, and fanatical while denying them the nobility or generosity of spirit. For slaves to behave courageously was against their very nature. There's no way a revolt of slaves could crush an actual Roman army. It wasn't possible. But there were the gladiators and their leader. Doublethink runs like a red thread through Roman attitudes towards Spartacus. Fear and scorn, hatred and admiration, indifference, obsession. They were all there. For the Romans, gladiators were to be fed, trained, cheered, adored, ogled, bedded, buried, and even occasionally freed, but never, never to be treated as equals. So, the Romans, as I said, felt confident in 73 that they could accomplish the task with 3,000 men. If this seems hard to understand, that Spartacus could be both revered and hated, think of Spartacus as an athlete who rejected the love of his fans. We can forgive an athlete who misbehaves, but not one who snubs us. That sparks hatred. Once Spartacus and his 73 companions left their barracks, they were no longer gladiators, but runaway gladiators. In Roman eyes, they shrank from a fight. Hence, they were moral lepers, cowardly, effeminate, and degenerate. We don't know what time of day the following action took place, but dusk would have served well. And before I get to that fight, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break, and I will pick right back up where I left off as Spartacus and the gladiators face their first real challenge in Claudius Glabba's newly formed Roman legion. pick up the action at dusk, the slopes of Vesuvius. The Romans had just moved into the area, and they had left the slopes mostly unguarded because they were so steep and rocky. The soil was crumbly and unstable. This impediment did not stop the rebels from using it to their advantage. The rebels, that is, fashioned ropes and harnesses and guide rails out of grapevines and other vegetation in the area. Use that to repel into the sleeping army's grasp. Sounds dangerous. But then again, Spartacus has brass balls. Vesuvius slope isn't vertical, and vines aren't supple or strong enough to be coiled around somebody's body, but the vine ropes probably served, as I said, as handhelds or guide rails, but one by one, the rebels climbed down and made their way through the camp. By this time, we can guess it was now night. Thracians specialized in night attacks. Spartacus might have wanted to deploy this to his advantage. The fugitives had carried out their escape under the eyes of careless Romans. Now they attacked. And Roman troops on campaign very rarely were the ones to be attacked. They were the ones to take offensive. And on campaign, they almost always constructed a defended camp to serve as a secure base for both attack and defense. Every camp was built on a standard pattern, usually a square divided by streets, tent lines, and horse lines, and surrounded by a ditch and rampart. As a Roman army completes its march, a good campsite was chosen. Surveyors carefully laid out the skeleton of the place, and then the men did the rest. The soldiers slept in leather tents, 8 men to a spot. The commander's tent, the praetorium, served as both living quarters and an army's headquarters. With 3,000 men as well as animals, Glaber's camp probably covered about 10 acres. Because the Romans prided themselves, as I said, on attacking the enemy, the camp's defenses were usually light. The ditch was normally only about 3 feet wide and deep, the rampart a low mound of earth topped with wooden stakes. Pickets perhaps were stationed outside the ramparts to warn of attack and to slow down the enemy. Of course, a dangerous and sly enemy required stronger defenses, but Glaber took Spartacus too lightly. The Roman, says one ancient source, did not yet consider this a war, but rather a raid, like an attack on bandits. Glaber seems to have ordered no special security. Another ancient source says the fugitives came from unexpected direction. Another, that they surrounded the camp. Another, that they came from a hidden exit in a crevice. It's not clear that they outnumbered the Romans, but they had the advantage of surprise. The ancients all agree that the Romans were shocked. And, well, they should have been. Spartacus's men probably picked off the sentries and then fell on the men in their tents. The sources all agree that the Roman soldiers fled. Triumphant and maybe even surprised at the ease of victory, Spartacus's forces took Glaber's camp. They promptly plundered the fuck out of it. No doubt they found food, clothing, weapons, and possibly even letters from the Senate. Meanwhile, the news of Glaber's defeat made its way slowly to Rome. The Senate appointed another praetor to replace him, another Publius Vernius. He recruited troops on the road as he marched south. Around the same time or shortly afterward, the Senate chose yet another praetor to advise and assist Vernius, Lucius Caecilius. Unfortunately, he's only a name to us. It appears, though, that Caecilius, too, was told to raise an army on the march. Spartacus's scouts were closely watching the movements of Vernius's colleague Caecilius. It was now that the Thracian caught Caecilius bathing in a villa near Pompeii. That sounds about right. The incident described earlier, Caecilius' humiliation, defeat, and death all followed fast. For the third time in a few months, a force of gladiators and fugitives had defeated an army led by a Roman senator. Rome doesn't like to be embarrassed, especially 3 times. The real campaign starts now, just as Spartacus's men come off 2 victories against new recruits within the legions of Rome. What choices he and his men make over the next few months sealed the campaign. With Rome closing in and supplies becoming sparse, the solution was another clever stratagem. In the second watch of the night, between 9 p.m. and midnight, as Rome's forces herald from all directions, Spartacus leaves camp in silence. Only a trumpeter remained behind. Meanwhile, they propped up corpses on stakes in the front of the gates. They even put clothes on them and weapons in their hands to make them look like guards. At the same time, they left campfires burning. The trick worked so well that it was only in the light of day that Vernius suspected something. He noticed the silence. Not only was the usual clanging and banging of a busy camp missing, so were the rebels' special touches. They had been throwing stones at the Romans, taunting them with insults, but alas, silence. And then the rebels moved from Vesuvius to Nuceria. The rebels had gone from strength to strength, yet, like the Romans, they too faced an autumn of discontent. In fact, the rebels staggered with success. Spartacus's men now had unrealistic expectations. I'm sure that he attempted to talk sense into them, and it nearly broke the army in two. They were, says a Roman source, no longer willing to obey him. The army had become too large, too unreasonable. What happened is this. Crixus was in favor of attacking Vernius, while Spartacus wanted to avoid pitched battle. And this is the difference between Crixus and Spartacus that appears again later on. Sure, it was a tactical difference, but a deeper strategic disagreement divided them. Crixus wanted to widen the war in Italy. He wanted more loot, more revenge, and no doubt more power. Spartacus didn't think that the rebels were winning. In fact, in his opinion, the men were now in mortal danger. Their movements were aimless and ad hoc. Sooner or later, the Romans would cut them off and wipe them out. To be safe, they needed to leave as quickly as possible. But remember, they're in southern Italy. Rome and many possible forces remain between them and possible escape into the Alps or into Thrace or to wherever it is that Spartacus wanted to lead them. Spartacus understood the difference between guerrilla and conventional warfare. Guerrillas cannot defeat a conventional army by military means. They can only frustrate it. As long as the conventional army retains its will to fight, it will win in the end. And it was impossible to imagine the Romans losing their will in Italy. Eventually, the Romans would wipe out the rebels. From the operational point of view, Spartacus might have been wrong. It was safer to defeat Vernius before heading north, but strategically, Spartacus was right. The rebels had to leave Italy, if not today or the next day, but soon. Eventually, they had to cross the Alps, which I think is Spartacus's final destination. Spartacus was unable to win his case, but he did a signal service to his people even so. He held the army together. Because if the army had split now at this juncture, it would have been a very quick revolt, and unlikely that I would be talking about it right now. Nevertheless, the rebels had no room for mistakes. Spartacus knew that his men were good, but also that they had been lucky. It was as much Roman incompetence that allowed them the luxury of going on raids instead of drilling soldiers, or of arguing with each other instead of fighting the enemy. In autumn of 73 BCE, when Spartacus and Crixus struck their deal, the army turned south, aiming to avoid Vernius. They doubtless avoided the Roman roads, which would have been easily guarded. Instead, they probably headed for the hills, perfect for guerrilla warfare. They likely traveled on byroads along mountain ridges, on the timeless paths of muleteers seated with their baskets, on trails beaten through the woods by herds migrating to the mountains in summer and back to the plain before winter. Heavy armed legionnaires and their supply wagons could not take such a route, but light armed rebels could. One autumn morning in 73, the fresh air of the valley was full of screams. Spartacus and his men had arrived. They immediately went on a rampage in southern Italy, pretty much against his orders. They raped young women and married women, and anyone who tried to resist this rampaging army was killed, sometimes even in the act of running away. Some of the rebels threw flaming torches onto the roofs of houses, Others followed local slaves to drag their masters or their treasures from their hiding places. Nothing was too holy or too heinous for the anger of the barbarians, and I should put that in quotations, the barbarians, these gladiators, these slave armies, their servile natures, says one Roman writer, and no help was forthcoming from Varinus' army. It was nowhere to be seen. So far, it seems that Spartacus has escaped. And then there were the local slaves of various national origins. Again, some of them had not waited to bring the rebels to their masters' hideouts, but instead they had pulled out their quivering overlords themselves. It was a kind of offering to the insurgents, and perhaps the local slaves were just trying to curry the favor with Spartacus's army. Perhaps they were remembering the whips, the chains, canes, stones, broken bones, gouged eyes, kicks, tongue lashings, executions, or other punishments that Roman slaves are known to have suffered. Or maybe they were thinking of minor humiliations like having their forehead tattooed, their master symbol, or having to pay the master for the privilege of having sex with another slave. Or maybe they recalled some friend or relative among the slaves who had been sold off because they were sick or aged. Regardless, the rebels stayed at Forum Ani for that day and the following night. For the local masters, it was 24 hours of savagery and slaughter. For the slaves, it was Liberation Day. They surely poured in from the surrounding area. Word of Spartacus would definitely have gotten around. Although Spartacus had used stealth and guise to get his army this far, you can only hide an army this large for so long. But because Forum Ani was not a big place, but by daybreak, Spartacus and Crixus had doubled the number of fugitive slaves in their group. Some of the new recruits would have been farmers, but if Spartacus had judged his prospects correctly, most of them would have been herdsmen. Eventually, Varinus and Spartacus's army fight. The details aren't known that well, but it is a good guess that the insurgents avoided pitched battle, preferring ambushes, traps, and hit-and-run tactics. Pitched battle's way too dangerous, because even if they outnumbered the Romans at this point, the rebels couldn't match their equipment. They still had to rely on do-it-yourself arms and armor. And one source makes it quite clear. They were used to weaving rustic baskets out of branches because of the lack of shields. Then they each used the same art to arm himself with small round shields like those used by cavalrymen. They stretched hides over the branches to cover them. The insurgents captured standards from Roman centurions, and eventually, with Varinus' defeats, they took control of Varinus' lictors with their bundles of rods and axes and their fasces. That symbolized the praetor's power. Varinus, like the praetors before him, had fallen to Spartacus. They also grabbed Varinus' horse. According to one source, they snatched it right from under him, making his capture a very close call. Varinus escaped, though, but the real and immediate winner was the man to whom the standards and fasces were brought to in triumph, Spartacus. It was now, it seems, that he really became great and frightening, as Plutarch describes him. The standards, the fasces, and the horse were better recruiting tools than a praetor's head on a pike, although the Celts, who were headhunters, might have disagreed. These standards were totems whose loss was immeasurable. The fasces was a sacred symbol, like a royal scepter or a bishop's crook. The horse was sacred to Celts, Germans, and Thracians. In the glow of these icons, Spartacus was more than an adventurer. He was more than a slave. He was more than a gladiator. To them, he almost became a king. After this, says one source, even more men, many more, came running to Spartacus's call. In a short time, they collected huge numbers of troops in southern Italy. Their recruits poured in, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in coarse woolen cloaks, sometimes carrying their chains. Numbers are difficult. The ancient sources vary greatly, ranging from 40,000 to as many as 120,000. To make matters worse, ancient statistics tend to be approximations, but around the time that they defeated Varinus, we can't be sure of the sequence of events. If I were to guess that the rebels this time had increased the amount of people in their army to probably 60 to 70,000. The rebels found themselves at Lucania's land end. The men who had washed their hands in blood in Capua now dipped their feet in the Ionian Sea. To be precise, they dipped them in a large inlet of the sea known as the Gulf of Tarentum, Mar Taranto. The tortoise waters of the Gulf, about 90 miles long and wide, was the arch of the Italian boot. And although Spartacus hated Rome, he didn't hesitate to borrow from it. During this time, as his army and his own legions grew, he modeled his army on said namesake. At least in some respects, they attained a certain level of skill and discipline that they had learned from us, said Caesar. The insurgents designated their units by Roman insignia. The victorious rebels had captured Roman battle flags, silver eagles, and fasces. The eagle was the symbol of a legion, while the flag stood for cohorts, about 480 men. The fasces were the insignia of a Roman praetor, consul, general, or governor. We might imagine that the insurgents proudly carrying Roman flags and eagles into battle to taunt the enemy. As for the fasces, Spartacus accepted them as symbols of his own office, presumably to be carried by his bodyguard. It was a sign of the world turned upside down, but it was also a symbol of discipline. This represented the power to punish. An effective commander must not merely be inspirational, but stern. No soldiers enjoy punishment, but most accept it as the price of victory. Punishment builds discipline. Discipline wins wars. Could the rebels keep this discipline? So far, it was only Spartacus's gravitas, his charisma, that has held them together, often turning in Spartacus's words when there's loot or savagery to be committed. But all he could do was try to make things work. And so tens of thousands of marching feet now echoed on the plains of Spartacus. As we might imagine, they meant something shameful for the Romans, honorable for the men. Slave legions. As one Roman writer put it, even a slave is a human being, and if a slave takes up arms, he may become as free as a Roman citizen. But as he adds, for a Roman to have to fight such a man is to add insult to injury. Rome fights back. This became a war without glory. In 72 BCE, Rome needed men to fight against Spartacus. About 150,000 Roman citizens, all from Italy, were already in arms abroad, well above the average annual figure of about 90,000 in arms between 79 and 50 BCE. But the recruiters would end up having to find many more soldiers, and it was a problem because by late 73 BCE, the Roman Senate, as one source claims, was no longer merely ashamed, but genuinely afraid. No more praetors. It was time to dispatch the two consuls. They would have 4 new legions, for a total of 20,000 men, and they were raised in the final months of 73 BCE. The consuls-elect sent out searchers, conquistadores, that is, recruiting officers to Italy's various towns. They preferred volunteers, but did not hesitate to pull out the census list and force men to their duty. Still, the sources state that Spartacus fought at least one, if not several, pitched battles against the Romans in 72 BCE. It is plausible that he dared to do so under the right circumstances. Hill country and mountains provided favorable terrain for these insurgents. Ambush, trickery, surprise, speed, psychological warfare all offered promising lines of attack. Superiority in cavalry gave Spartacus a way to harass the enemy's flanks and neutralize Roman light-armed troops. The events of Spartacus's War of 72 BCE exploded into Rome's consciousness. They shocked the city and marked the turning point in the rebels' fortunes. As spring unfolds and the start of the campaign season in 72, the Romans learned that the rebels had split into 2 groups. One led by Spartacus, the other Crixus. Both men were on the move. Crixus's group remained in southern Italy, not in Thurii. It headed to Apulia, a wealthy agricultural region of gently rolling hills and a stark mountain. Spartacus's forces meanwhile turned north. Like the Romans, we cannot be sure what the 2 groups were up to. Was the split tactical or strategic, friendly or hostile? An ancient source says that Crixus left because of his arrogance and presumption. Perhaps, but irregular armies break up as easily as volcanic soil. Crixus and Spartacus had already disagreed several times the year before over whether to stay in Italy and loot or find a way to get the fuck out. Meanwhile, ethnic differences between the Thracian and the Celt, perhaps even rival ambitions and the natural jealousies of former gladiators, made common cause difficult. Nevertheless, a friendly divorce made sense. Spartacus's supporters followed him not because he was Thracian, though, but because he was fucking Spartacus, the man with the brass balls. By now, the rebels had taken his measure. They recognized a winning general when they saw one. The advantage to Spartacus was this: Crixus took the ones that were more likely to loot and to lose discipline, and Spartacus was left with those that were exactly the opposite. Spartacus was a favorite of the gods. He was huge. He was a big gladiator. His gestures were vivid and they moved the rebels. His austerity hardened them. His generosity helped them. They had hope. His care for innocent civilians may have left them cold, but it underscored the word that sums up Spartacus: righteous. Spartacus's authority was neither formal nor forced. It was moral. As Napoleon said, in war, the moral is to the material as 3 to 1. No wonder 3/4 of the army followed Spartacus and left Crixus. Either in Rome or in the field, the Romans got the news that the insurgents had divided. And Lentulus, one of the consuls' assignment was to deal directly with Spartacus, while Gellius, the other consul, would attack Crixus first and join the campaign later against Spartacus. Lentulus had a much tougher job, so we might imagine that he had planned to nip at Spartacus's heel, kind of committing his own warfare, his own guerrilla warfare, while avoiding battle until Gellius arrived. As it turned out, when Gellius did arrive, it came with good news: the first Roman victory of the war. Gellius's army crushed Crixus's army. The struggle took place in Apulia, near Mount Garganius, or now Gargano, sometimes called the Spur of Italy. Both armies no doubt advanced with war cries to hearten themselves and frighten their opponent. The Roman light-armed infantry usually tried to soften up the enemy by shooting arrows and slings, some of which had an effective range of perhaps about 100 yards. But the two armies, hidden in this obscure part of Italy, facing off against each other, one barbarians, the other legions. After absorbing any losses, the insurgents probably raised the rebel yell, blew their war trumpet, and Roman armies typically advanced by banging javelins on shield and shouting war cries. As the legions closed in, at a distance about 50 feet, they would have begun throwing their javelins. They shouted, accompanied by the threatening rumble of the commander's horn, followed by the strident call of the trumpets. Then, with their banners flying, they charged the enemy at a run. Sometimes the Romans would make such an intimidating show of discipline and equipment that the enemy would turn and run away. But on this day, it would come down to a hard fight. Legionnaires would hack and thrust at the enemy with their swords, while the other side would reply with sword or spear. Ancient battle lives in the imagination as a climax, a collision, followed by dozens of disorderly individual fights that go on until one side prevails. Real ancient battle was probably episodic. Like boxers, the two sides combined, broke apart, regrouped each in their own corner, and then hit each other again and again. Finally, one army would collapse and run. Such a typical Roman battle lasted 2 or 3 hours, but episodes of hand-to-hand fighting probably each lasted only 15 to 20 minutes before exhaustion set in. The insurgents perhaps forced the Romans to fight many rounds of battle. We don't know, but before a decision was reached, it was enough to do the rebels honor, but not to avoid a massacre. According to one source, 2/3 of Crixus's men died. Among the fallen was Crixus himself. This too fits the picture of Celtic warfare. Celtic warriors were supposed to group themselves around their chiefs in battle. It was a disgrace to abandon one's chief, and it was unthinkable for a chief to do anything but fight to the finish. It was the first defeat after a string of victories for the rebels. How can such a reversal of fortune be explained? Certainly not by the prowess of Gallius and Arius. As events later on in 72 BCE will show, they had not created a victory machine. The cause of defeat probably lay with Crixus. Surprise, surprise. He might have been Spartacus's equal in courage, but not in common sense. That Crixus shared Spartacus' taste for discipline and austerity is doubtful. That he lacked due diligence when it comes to scouts and pickets is mostly apparent. Meanwhile, Spartacus marched north. He was somewhere in the Apennine Mountains in north-central Italy. The rebels had marched from a land of olive oil to one of butter, a zone that was cooler, rainier, and greener than the south. There was plenty of fresh water and herds of sheep and goats, wolves and bears. As a landscape, the Apennines are vertical, narrow, and difficult, all of which worked in the insurgents' favor. Even so, the Romans wanted to fight Spartacus head-on. Roman doctrine fucking called for it. It called to fight the army in a pitched battle. The offensives and Crix's fate bode well for success against Spartacus's army. But Spartacus had reason for optimism. His men had fine leadership, unlike Crixus. Their past victories should have been a morale boost. With Spartacus at the head, they have yet to be defeated, and their cavalry force should have been better than the Romans. Nevertheless, the Romans found the enemy and forced him to fight on what looked like auspicious terms. The consul Lentulus, thanks no doubt to good intelligence, was able to block the road ahead of Spartacus. Meanwhile, Gellius, conqueror of Crixus, had marched up from Apulia in rapid pursuit of the main rebel army. It appeared that Spartacus was trapped, mountains on one side, sea on the other. But sometime in the Apennines in 72 BCE, Spartacus achieved something great. Admittedly, the Thracian situation was less desperate than you would expect, right? It seemed that Spartacus was trapped. Spartacus outnumbered the enemy. He had 30,000 men, while each consular army had a maximum of maybe 10,000. Gellius's army might in fact have even been smaller with their fight against Crixus. However, the rebels attacked. The Romans' response was to panic and flee. So, picking one of the armies, Spartacus just said, fuck it, I don't want to get pinched, let's just pick one and go for it. And they finally gave the Romans the pitched battle that they so desperately wanted. But the Romans' response was to shit their pants, and it disgraced the tradition of the legions. The insurgents' attack was no doubt terrifying, but a disciplined army should have held its ground against such discordant forces. The Romans were usually disciplined, but they had long experience fighting barbarians. They had often defeated much larger armies. But in 72 BCE, neither their training, their trust, nor apparently their commander was enough to make the legionnaires stand firm against Spartacus. This was an insult. Nothing, said Cicero, could have been more polluted, deformed, perverted, or disturbed after the defeat of the consul. What Spartacus did next was to give a gladiatorial games for his slaves, a spectacle that Rome usually reserved for free people. Spartacus added a bitter twist by reversing roles. He made the slaves the spectators, and the Romans the gladiators. The occasion was Crixus's funeral games, and the capture and defeat of one of the armies. The news of his comrade's death and defeat had reached Spartacus, perhaps via a messenger, perhaps from the survivors of Crixus's army. To have a pair of gladiators fight at the grave of a great man was an old Italian custom. Spartacus did not have merely one pair of gladiators fight. Rather, he commemorated the fallen Crixus by a spectacular ritual. Spartacus called up 300 to 400 Roman prisoners and had them fight to the death around a pyre, a symbol of Crixus assuming that his corpse had not been recovered. This was a gladiatorial offering on a grand scale. It was all but human sacrifice, glorious to the memory of the dead, humiliating to the Romans who were about to die, and ennobling to the reputation of the host. Their scouts might have told the rebels that trouble awaited them thereafter. About 10 miles north of the Apennines lay the city of Mutina, one of about 10 Roman and Latin colonies in the province. Mutina was the base of the governor proconsul Gaius Cassius Longinus. As provincial governor, Cassius had a standing garrison army to draw on, consisting of 2 legions of about 10,000 men. And it is possible that he was assisted by the praetor Gnaeus Manlius. Cassius had been one of the 2 consuls the year before in 73 BCE, and earlier had served as mintmaster and then eventually praetor. It was a successful career, befitting his old and eminent family, but Cassius is best known for his son, also named Cassius, the famous murderer of Caesar. The son had a lean and hungry look, as Shakespeare later put it, and the father might have been equally keen. He was the only card that Rome had left to play between Spartacus and the Alps. And that's what Cassius did. He threw down the gauntlet. As Spartacus was pressing forward towards the Alps, leaving the Apennines behind, Cassius met him. Only the barest details of the battle survive. After Spartacus defeated Gellius's army and moved north, the insurgents crushed Cassius and the Romans, inflicting many casualties. Cassius barely escaped with his life. At this time, even more people flocked to Spartacus, and he could not afford to turn away good men because the Romans were about to attack him again. The 2 consuls, Gellius and Lentulus, had regrouped and joined forces after their earlier defeats. They now had an army of 4 legions, probably reduced from the losses they had suffered and not been able to replace. But Spartacus probably enjoyed something like a 3-1 advantage. He probably would have commanded about 60 to 70,000 men by this time. And this would have been in late 72 BCE, as, again, Gellius and Lentulus had joined forces. The conclusion is clear, though. We don't know how many men Spartacus has had, but an educated guess of that 60 to 70,000 at the peak in late 72 seems sensible, and even conservative. In fact, 60,000 is the lowest estimate in the ancient sources for the size of Spartacus's army. Other figures are sometimes well over 100,000. In addition to the soldiers that were unknowable number of civilians, women, children, and perhaps even old men. But this scene, this battle, shows the insurgents at their best. They isolated an enemy unit. They executed a difficult maneuver of attacking uphill, a move in which their lighter armor probably increased their mobility and successfulness. Although the rebels didn't destroy Lentulus's men before reinforcements arrived, they inflicted heavy losses. Presumably, Lentulus expected the reinforcements to defeat the enemy, but that didn't happen. Either the rebels on the hill remained strong enough to turn on the reinforcements and overpower them, or Spartacus sent fresh troops against the reinforcements, which would speak well of his command and control of the battlefield. Again, Roman legions, who were used to defeating larger armies, failed in the field of battle. And once again, they ran from the field. Spartacus looked down at first for running from the ludus, now had caused Roman armies to flee at the sight of his army 4 separate times. Spartacus had reason to be pleased, but he also had cause to reevaluate the attack on Rome, and he was thinking about it. His army, like I said, could possibly have been measured at 100,000 people, almost impossible to feed. But where is the best loot in ancient Rome? Within the walls of Rome itself. But, as one ancient account says, he changed his mind about going to Rome because his forces weren't appropriate, true story, for the operation, nor was his whole army prepared as soldiers. As a reminder, remember, there were only a few gladiators probably left at this point. Most of them were just slaves. Countryside slaves trained up by Spartacus. Rome's stone walls were over 13 feet thick, and in places sometimes 30 feet high. The circuit of walls ran for nearly 7 miles and enclosed 1,000 acres. Spartacus didn't know how to build siege engines, nor did he have experts to man them. He had few, if any, soldiers with experience of laying siege to a city or taking a city by assault. Nor had Spartacus' experience of battle in 72 BC been entirely encouraging. Sure, he had won every engagement, but his colleague Crixus had been destroyed. The Romans, meanwhile, refused to accept defeat. There is an army at Rome's doorstep. Of course they wouldn't accept defeat. No matter how hard Spartacus hit the Romans, they kept coming back. And this was a sign. This should have been the sign that things were about to get hairy. There was no reason to doubt that Rome would return. It was far more prudent to prepare for the next battle than to open a new front that was unlikely to bring success. And so, the army returned to southern Italy. Oh, Spartacus, I just don't understand. You defeated the 2 consuls. You defeated the ex-consulate, Cassius. The way to the Alps was literally open for you. There's nothing standing between you and the Alps. You defeated every challenger. This was your opportunity to fucking leave, and you missed it. You could have set up a fucking kingdom in the north, and you fucking missed your opportunity. Yes, the passage over the Alps would have been dangerous. It would have been difficult, but if you had just been able to convince the rest of your army, even swelled with victory as they were, this sense of invincibleness that you have bestowed upon these people that had previously had no hope, if you had been able to convince them just to move to the north through the Alps, perhaps we would be speaking your name in reverence to an actual king. But alas, you moved south, past Rome, and back into southern Italy. And there in southern Italy, the insurgents had yet another encounter with the Roman army, possibly under the praetorship Manlius. They defeated the Romans again, and they again reaped a rich load of booty, probably further ennobling these slaves. It was a happy end to the journey. Yet the men had reason to wonder just what they had achieved. They had made a punishing trip of about 1,200 miles, which could hardly have taken them less than 4 or 5 months, which is incredible. Considering the marching rates of ancient armies and the time needed to stop, forage, and fight, including 4 battles, mourning their colleagues' defeat in a 5th, and amassed loot, they had buried old comrades, attracted new ones, and made one hell of a story. They might glory in their success as the dominant army in Italy. It was astonishing truth. It just was that most would have ascribed to the gods, and perhaps above all to Dionysus. Yet the rebels were only as strong as their ability to beat Rome's next army. The army was sure to come, even if vain rebels and pessimistic Romans both failed to see it in the distance. By summer's end, Italy had seen 2 big stories in 72 BCE. One was Spartacus's long march, and the other was Rome's disgrace. A rabble in arms had defeated a regular army. Again, the decision lay at Spartacus's feet. March south and continue the fight against Rome and Italy, or head north, with all armies currently defeated and the path clear. Perhaps Rome would finally respond to the threat. Perhaps Rome would finally get the vengeance that now they desired, that Spartacus instilled upon the prideful Romans. Perhaps the rebels had finally played their winning hand, and now it appears that Rome readies itself to respond to the threat as they should have in the beginning, by mustering a lethal force and putting it under the command of a proper general, not some senator, upstart, or counselor looking to make his fame by the defeat of Spartacus. For now, let us take one final break, and when we return, we will begin with part 3. Rome is coming, bitches. Rome's coming back. In the autumn of 72 BC, a new general took command of the legions. Determined to restore discipline, he revived a brutal and archaic form of punishment. What was this punishment exactly? 50 Roman soldiers who ran away from battle and disgraced the legions were caught, and they were condemned and executed by their own army. Each of them was clubbed to death by 9 of his fellow legionnaires. Men with whom they might have changed places since the victims were chosen by lot. 500 men were caught shirking their duty. 1 out of every 10 was selected for execution, which is why the procedure is called decimation. Rome's new general wanted his men to fear him more than they feared Spartacus. His name, Marcus Licinius Crassus. His moment came in autumn of 72 BCE when Rome entrusted Crassus with a special command to fight Spartacus. Why Crassus wanted the command is no mystery. It could have made his career. Up to then, he advanced more slowly in politics than a man of his ambition would have wished. He had served as praetor at some point, it seems, but he had not held Rome's top office, the consulship. A special command opened the door to military glory, which would have put political preeminence within reach. Defeating Spartacus would have given Crassus a card to play against Pompey. Then, too, Pompey Crassus had his economic interests at stake. Since he owned large slave-run estates in southern Italy, he fitted the profile of Spartacus's victims. Putting down the rebellion would not just bring Crassus glory, but save his investments. Crassus raised 6 new legions of about 30,000 men in total. He commanded them well as the remaining troops of the 4 legions previously commanded by Gellius and Lentulus, perhaps another 16,000 men. Crassus then counted around 45,000 legionaries. This was an enormous army, about the same size as the army that Caesar would later use to conquer Gaul. It was more than twice as large as any force that the Romans had sent out yet against Spartacus. And if Spartacus had at this point a little bit more than 60,000 men, then he continued to outnumber the Romans. But that probably didn't bother Crassus very much. Roman military doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, and the Romans often went into battle outnumbered, especially against those considered barbarians. Crassus entrusted command of the 2 legions to Mummius. According to one source, these were the legions formerly under Gellius and Lentulus, and not the new units raised by Crassus. Crassus gave explicit orders to Mummius. He was to follow Spartacus like a dog, but not to fight him. Not even in a skirmish. Evidently, the plan was to pressure Spartacus without risking a defeat against his battle-hardened troops. Unfortunately, instead of obeying orders, like it seems all of the Roman idiots before him, Mummius took advantage of the first good chance to join battle. Maybe he occupied the high ground, or perhaps the scout said that the enemy had its guard down, whatever. In any case, Mummius got his ass kicked. As the sources put it, again, many of his men fell, and many saved themselves by dropping their weapons and running away like a little bitch. In the ancient world, dropping one's weapons to save one's life earned a man great shame. It practically defined cowardice. Crassus chose those first 500 runaways to have returned to his camp. They named them tremblers, to use the old Spartan term employed by Plutarch to describe these men. Maybe these 500 soldiers belonged to one legionary cohort. Crassus divided the 500 men into 50 groups of 10 men each, and as I said earlier, brought back something fucking brutal. And they had one man in each one of these groups of 10 men, chosen by lot. These 50 men were forced to undergo decimation. A tenth of the 500 runaways had been chosen by lot and were clubbed to death by the rest of the other 9/10. Crassus, it seems, revived it with a vengeance. In historical times, the norm for decimation seems to have been 5, 8, or 20 men. Crassus had chosen 50. Spartacus, again swelling with victory, led his men toward the other exit from the Italian peninsula. He marched them to the sea. Assuming they had enough of a head start on the enemy, they could have taken the Via Anaya southward toward the city of Rhegium. Down the road they went, past the cities of Atina, Nurlum, Cosentia, and Tyrrhena, until they finally reached the Tyrian Sea. As it hugs the mountainside near Italy's southern tip, the road turns a bend and presents the traveler with a sudden panorama below. Sicily, rising majestically in the hazy blue sea. Only the narrow strait of Messenia separates Sicily from the Italian mainland. Sicily is the largest island in the Mediterranean, yet 2 of its 3 sides are visible from this point in Italy. An ancient traveler might have stood in wonder at the thought of the wealth and fertility that lay before him on the island. Sicily was Rome's first overseas province and remained its most important. Famous in antiquity for its fertile soil, the island provided much of Rome's grain. It was rich in cattle as well, lush and abundant. Sicily was a great prize. It fed the legions, and Spartacus might have reasoned that it too could feed his men. Sicily has long been a goal of Italy's runaway slaves, who sought refuge there. In addition, the island seemed ripe for subversion. By stirring up the embers of the slave revolts of the past that had convulsed the island a generation previously, Spartacus could threaten Rome's food supply and further shake the pillars of the social order. Maybe this was his goal all along, leaving the Alps. Maybe what he sought was the prize of Sicily. By transferring his men there from Italy, he could save them from Crassus, who seemed so dogged, so unwilling to leave his heels. So Spartacus and his men might have reasoned when they reached the vicinity of Rhegium in late 72 BCE. All they had to do was cross a narrow body of water. And the plan here? Well, they said, let's hire some fucking pirates to get us to Sicily. And if you can imagine, the plan didn't work. And I'll give you one guess why. Who did they say they would hire? Pirates. Are pirates trustworthy? Fuck no. And they did the pirate-like thing. They took some of their stuff and said, sorry, dealing with Crassus and the rest of Rome for helping you seems like a really bad idea right now. But thank you for some of these things. And we're going to leave you down here in southern Italy with absolutely no way to get to Sicily. And with Crassus bearing down on you from the north. Have a good fucking day, Sir Spartacus. Shit. Spartacus sat down in the strait, and Crassus wouldn't have wanted to risk attacking the rebels there. The narrow coastal strip offered little room for pitched battle that the Romans so often desired. Besides, if challenged, Spartacus would send his men into the hills rather than agree to fight that type of battle. His cavalry could harass the Romans, while his infantry would lay ambushes in the many hills and gullies in the region. On top of all that, it was starting to get cold. It was wintertime. And wintertime, for armies like this, was no time for fighting. Rather than risk such engagements, Crassus was like, you know what? I'm just going to build embattlements all along southern Italy so you can't get back up north. Spartacus realized this. He's like, son of a bitch, he's building embattlements. We're not going to be able to get up there. What am I going to do? I'm going to build some rafts. Rafts are always a good idea. They'll get me to Sicily, and I can do the thing I need to, and we'll shake the pillars of Rome. And he fails to build these rafts in any sort of time frame that would allow him to do it. Cassius takes this tie with Spartacus south to fortify the passes against him as Spartacus tries to build his rafts. His men end up building some pretty huge fortifications around the coast while attempting to blockade Spartacus's return. Spartacus had no other choice but to turn north. No doubt the need to leave Italy was clearer now than ever, but the Strait of Messina would not be the exit. They wouldn't be able to leave to Sicily. The Thracian would have to come up with a new strategy. At the moment, Spartacus's priority was feeding the army. There was food about a dozen miles to the south in the city of Rhegium, but the town was walled and no doubt well defended. This is the next thing. I really do think if Spartacus had taken his army to Rhegium at that point, they probably could have captured it. Even with it being walled, the walls weren't nearly as high as that of Rome, and even though well defended, there's no way it would have been able to be well defended against the amount of troops that Spartacus had. Because of Crassus in the north, he wouldn't have been able to necessarily lay siege to it, but I think a well thought out plan might have brought Rhegium to Spartacus's feet. The other thing that would have done, which would have been to Spartacus's advantage, is it would have given him a walled place to defend against Crassus, and further advantage to maybe work out another way to get out of there. Alas, that wasn't the case. They said, nope, we're not going to do that. We're not going to go to Rhegium. The next easiest alternative for food was to head north on the Via Anaya, but the Romans surely had that road blocked, so Spartacus and his followers took the least desirable escape route and climbed in the Aspromonte Mountains. If any of Spartacus's marching men turned and watched the sun disappear behind Sicily's hills, we don't know. But if they did, they might have paused and thought about what might have been. Crassus's, at this point, main problem was political. Rome wanted him to crush the enemy, but Crassus preferred strangulation instead, and that took time. And this I often think of in relation to the vision that the Thracian woman had in the very beginning of this episode. A snake coiled around Spartacus's face. Maybe that didn't portend to a great revolt after all. Maybe it was the portrayal of the eventual future of Spartacus. Crassus slowly wrapping itself around Spartacus, constricting the air out of him, not allowing him to breathe or live in security. Crassus was the snake, and Spartacus was in trouble. Spartacus increased Roman frustration by prolonging the struggle. He distracted, exasperated, and delayed the enemy forces. Sources say Spartacus annoyed the men in the defensive works in many ways, from place to place. He constantly fell upon them unaware, threw bundles of wood in the trenches and set them on fire, which gave the Romans nasty and difficult work, as they hustled to put out the flames. Conditions were miserable. Food was in short supply, and it would be surprising if some men weren't deserting at this point. The Thracian decided to shock them out of their funk. He crucified a Roman prisoner in the space between the two armies. Well, that's one way to fucking do it. The sources report thereby showing to his men the sight of what they could expect if they did not win. There was nothing subtle about this gesture. It was no exaggeration. Spartacus' next move was even more Machiavellian. Apparently he got wind that Pompey was coming. Son of a bitch. It's not difficult to imagine Roman soldiers lining the walls, hurling taunts at the enemy. Pompey was coming, and they had better watch out. Pompey had a reputation. His nickname earned in the Sullan era was the Teenage Butcher. His name might indeed have frightened some of the rebels, but Spartacus saw through it. Spartacus understood Pompey as a threat, he also recognized an opportunity. Pompey gave Crassus and Spartacus a common enemy. They both wanted to keep him out of the war, which would explain Spartacus's next move. He offered Crassus a peace treaty. Again, brass fucking balls. In particular, he offered something very Roman, which was to ask Rome to accept him into fides. Fides is an important Latin word with a rich set of meaning. It means faith or trust, and in this case, protection. However seriously Rome took a fides relationship, fides? Other people are better at Latin. The man who negotiated, usually a general, regarded it with even more importance. He became the personal patron of Rome's client, with whom he enjoyed especially intense ties. If Crassus had accepted Spartacus's offer, he would have become the Thracians' patron. Doing so would have been repugnant, though. Again, slaves. Rome hates slaves. They love them, but they hate them. Rome regarded a request for fides as a formal act of surrender, but even so, it conferred a most beautiful dignity on the client. In this case, would have been Spartacus. By accepting the Thracian into his fides, Crassus would have conceded not only Spartacus's dignity, but also Spartacus's right to settle his men somewhere in safety. That would just never do, especially after the humiliation that Spartacus has put to Rome. To grant such honor to runaway slaves and gladiators was out of the fucking question. Rome wanted Spartacus's head, not his handshake, and Crassus disdainfully ignored the offer. Yet, what magnificent gall on Spartacus's part. The proposal was, far from conceding defeat, he asserted his right to respect. Hey, you son of a bitch, you haven't got me yet, and perhaps we could be friends. But fuck you. If nothing else, this tactic might have been a morale boost for his men. If he was stuck in Crassus' trap, Spartacus didn't even show that it fazed him. In fact, he was about to demonstrate his ability to escape, because his cavalry had finally arrived. Perhaps it's now February 71 BCE. Spartacus' situation continued to be difficult, and so he did the only thing he could with his cavalry in tow. He and his army made a bold plan to bust through Crassus' fortification. They did so quite successfully, which I'm guessing would have royally fucking pissed Crassus off. My guess is they picked the least fortified section of Crassus' embattlements and just pushed their way through as a massive army only could. Crassus had gambled and failed, which pissed Rome off, emboldened Spartacus, but Spartacus paid a price in blood by breaking free. For sure, it was a tremendous victory for the slaves and a bitter defeat for the Romans, because now all that time spent building in the winter was for nothing. They now had to abandon their defenses they had worked so hard on, and once again chase Spartacus through southern Italy. That had to have been really fucking annoying. Just imagine being in one of these armies that just survive the winter and you're like, this is finally going to end. There's no way Spartacus gets through us. I can finally go home to my family. And then 60 miles away, you hear that he broke through the defenses. And you shit a brick. God damn it, now I have to chase Spartacus again through southern Italy. Fuck myself. Eventually, Spartacus led his army north through Bruttium and back to Lucania, heading for Samnium. It was not to be, though. The rebel army broke up again. Ugh. Just another blow to Spartacus. A large contingent of Celts and Germans decided to go off on their own. Their leaders were named Castus and Canicus, or Gannicus. The sources put the group at well over 30,000 men, so probably a little bit less than half of Spartacus's army. As always with these things, the figures are at best guesses. Educated guesses, but guesses. It's not clear if all the Celts and Germans in the rebellion joined them, nor do we know if any other nationalities chose the splinter group, that offshoot. In any case, we needn't conclude that the split was a matter of tribal politics. A reasonable person might have argued that Spartacus had failed and needed to be replaced. Which is dumb because without him, they never would have even gotten that far, regardless. It could have been said that he had wasted valuable time and lives in his pursuit of Sicily. If he had saved the army on Mellenia Ridge, he had also brought it there in the first place. According to the sources, before he learned about the breakup, Crassus was afraid that Spartacus was leading his men toward Rome again. And this may be just what Castus and Canicus wanted to do. dreaming of storming the enemy's citadel. Perhaps they scorned the idea of retreating to Samnium. But before that could happen, Crassus laid the groundwork for an attack so well. He divided his forces into 2 marching camps, each with its own trench and earthworks. He placed both camps near the enemy in a gesture of self-confidence and intimidation. Crassus set up his headquarters tent in the larger of the 2 camps. Then, on a designated night, he pulled out all his troops out and posted them in the foothills of the mountain. We don't know which mountain, but a mountain. He left his headquarters tent in the camp, though, in order to fool the enemy. Next, Crassus split his cavalry into 2 groups. He sent 1 unit under Lucius Quinctus, his legate, with orders to tempt Spartacus with a feigned battle. It is a tribute to Quinctus's professionalism that he executed the maneuver well. Then again, the example of decimation of Mummius's troops after they had failed to carry out a similar maneuver against Spartacus no doubt focused the minds of his men. In any case, they followed orders. They neutralized Spartacus's forces while avoiding losses of their own. The other group of cavalry had a job that also called for finesse. Arguably, they had the more difficult task. They had to approach the German and Celtic forces under Castus and Gannicus and lure them out to fight, only to simulate retreat. Crassus split his army, one just saying, "Hey Spartacus, we're over here, just kidding. Hey Spartacus, we're over here, just kidding," to keep them busy. The other one, same thing, sent it to Gannicus. "Hey, we're over here." The goal, to draw them out. The goal is to lead the enemy into a trap of Crassus's employee. And Crassus and his infantrymen were waiting, perhaps around a bend in the hills. The rebels followed Crassus's cavalrymen right into the ambush. At this point, Roman cavalry fell back into the wings, drawn up in battle formation opposite the rebels. It was Crassus's dream and Spartacus's nightmare. Whether that was still possible now that the trap had been sprung is doubtful. Besides, even if they could have fled, the men of Castus and Gannicus were unlikely to have done so. They had the stain of their fight at Camalotrum to wipe out, a loss they had suffered earlier. They stood and they fought. For Celts, battle was a religious act. Beforehand, they vowed to their war god the booty they hoped to take. Their thoughts went to the aftermath of a successful battle, and when they could sacrifice captive animals, bury the enemy's weapons, and cut off the heads of his slaughtered chiefs. If they lost the battle, well, a man's ultimate offering to the gods was his own body, and a pious Celt would give it gladly. The odds didn't favor them against Crassus. He probably outnumbered them, and his men certainly far outstripped the enemy in weapons and discipline. Castus and Gannicus no doubt displayed good leadership, but they're unlikely to have matched Spartacus's tactical gifts. Above all, the Celtic way of war stood in the way of success. Unlike the Romans, who emphasized coordination and discipline, in a group battle, Celts thought of battle as a series of heroic duels. Celts, and Germans too, grouped themselves in battle around their hero chiefs, fighting along with them to victory or death. This was no way to counteract the military science of the legions. As a Roman veteran, Spartacus knew this, and that's why he always tried to avoid a pitched battle when he could. And no doubt, during the time that Spartacus was there, he labored mightily to cure his men of the notion. But Spartacus was gone. Catana proved to be a crushing Roman victory. No figures of their losses survived. The sources disagree about the number of rebel casualties. Some say 30 to 35,000, while Plutarch records 12,300. There's no way it was all 30 or 35,000 died. It's safer to say that the rebels suffered a large amount of losses, very large, huge. A majority of their army was probably wiped out. Both traditions agree that Castus and Gannicus died on the battlefield, just like Crixus. Plutarch states that this was the most valiant battle of all that Crassus fought. The author was referring to the stiff resistance that the Celts and Germans put up. Only 2 dead men out of the 12,300 were found with back wounds, according to Plutarch. Poor Spartacus, who probably said, "Hey, just like Crixus, if you leave, you're probably going to die." Nevertheless, 2 of his friends, 2 of his ex-gladiators, went off to fight their own battle and got cut off. Surely Spartacus mourned Castus and Gannicus, just as he had mourned Crixus. This time, though, he did not have the leisure to hold funeral games or force Roman prisoners to fight as gladiators in their honor. More than half of their army had been decimated at the hands of Crassus. Celts and Germans, Thracians, were all men of honor. Spartacus was enough of a Roman, though, to think of survival. At this point, there was, he knew, no shame to live and fight again another day. And it was a shame. Perhaps they mourned too long, or perhaps they tried to meet up with Gannicus's army and failed. But wherever they were going, wherever that army was heading, they didn't get very far before the Romans caught up to them. This army, which had ceaselessly been on the move without proper materials, without proper supplies, without proper shoes and boots, without proper weapons and armor, I'm sure was exhausted. Battle after battle, against fresh recruits, no less. Against fresh people, battle after battle after battle, running. At this point, more than 1,500 miles. Time caught up with Spartacus. But once again, Crassus had misplaced his trust. Just like he had trusted Mummius, he trusted this Quinctus and Scroffa, and they done fucked up. He's like, hey, go pursue Spartacus. Just, don't get in the fight. And guess what? Spartacus, in one last badass move, he did what he was supposed to. He turned and said, stop fucking following me, you cunts. Leave me alone. Well, that's in his red-headed glory. And that's what happened. He ended up beating the combined army. And again, I'm sure Crassus was pissed. He had misplaced his trust. And things went badly for the Romans. Scroffa was wounded, and his men barely carried him back to safety. But at this point, the Thracian was practically at the gates of Rome. His slaves and gladiators had already reached the Appian Way, and a march of 50 miles would bring them to Venusia, an ancient city planted in the shadow of an extinct volcano. Majestic Mount Vulture, Venusia had been a Roman colony for 200 years. Now, in the spring of 71 BCE, it would have been well advised to firm up its walls. Surely raiding parties had already looted outlying farms, and raids were perhaps the least of it. By this point, people were saying this of the rebels. They indiscriminately mix murder, arson, theft, and rape. Of course they would say that. They're Romans. They took Roman citizens prisoner, as has already been proven. They even made them fight gladiatorial duels. One Roman matron was supposed to even have killed herself in torment over the violation of her sexual honor. Venusians could imagine worse still, based on recent experience. After joining the rebels against Rome in the Social War, Venusia had been stormed and recaptured by a Roman army in 88 BCE. Spartacus doesn't get there. After defeating different parts of Crassus's army, Crassus himself finally catches Spartacus. Plutarch, who tells the tale, makes it sound of Spartacus's men turn and attack the ditch diggers of Crassus. They did it of their own accord, and so forced Spartacus's hand. With his army going in for the attack, Spartacus rallies his troops, and seeing the necessity, Plutarch writes of what happened next. Spartacus stands at the head, arranging his entire army in battle formation, but it is just as likely that Spartacus had sent his men out deliberately. We don't know. A veteran like Spartacus should have foreseen Crassus's trenches and their threat to the rebel cavalry. A successful flank attack by the rebel cavalry could break up Rome's light infantry, has been shown again and again in this fucking chase. A cavalry ride surely played a role in Spartacus's battle plan, and he's likely to have had one. He may have wanted to fight at first, but once he realized the inevitability of battle, Crassus bearing down on him, Spartacus would have set his mind to work. Before the fight began, each commander addressed his troops, or at least a portion of them within earshot. Crassus's words do not survive. But Spartacus engaged in a bold gesture. After calling for his horse to be brought to him, he drew out his sword and addressed his soldiers. According to Plutarch, he said that if he won, he would have many horses, and good ones from the enemy, but if he lost, he wouldn't be in need of one. He then sacrificed his own mount. Sure, now and then an ancient general sent away his horse and fought on foot in order to encourage the men, but Spartacus and his giant brass balls took a further step and engaged in a religious ritual, the solemn gesture of a man facing death. Spartacus's gesture stood out for its drama, but not for its pursuit of the sacred. Every ancient people considered war a religious act and consulted the gods before a battle. by killing his own horse. Spartacus made a vow in the hope of victory. He also made policy decisions about tactics and morale. Generals normally fought on horseback. By killing his horse, Spartacus might have improved the men's morale, but at the price of limiting his mobility and vision. This was it. Without his horse, Spartacus couldn't change plans once the fighting began, nor flee if things went badly. That was never his intention. I couldn't find anything on this, but I think that his Thracian wife or somebody close to him had died, and I think Spartacus he'd had enough. He was tired, his army was tired, and I think he's just said, fuck it. If I'm going to go out, I'm going to go out. Perhaps they responded well to Spartacus's courage. They usually did. I mean, behind Spartacus, they had never actually lost a battle. Maybe they sung and danced in sight of the enemy. Perhaps the Celts among them that had rejoined redoubled the taunts they customarily leveled at the enemy. On the other side, though, commanders signaled, banners waved, trumpets blared, and again they fought. Spartacus's plan was a brave one. He was to go kill the leader of the enemy himself. His goal was to make it to Crassus, and Spartacus's charge is one of the most unforgettable events in ancient warfare. It was a real-life Aristeia. To use a Greek word borrowed from the Romans, Aristeia is an epic story of a warrior's heroic deeds. The Romans marveled at his courage. Spartacus fought fortissimi, writes one author, that is, with the height of personal bravery. As he cut men down, and he faced off, looking furiously towards Crassus. He killed centurions left and right, who fought hand to hand with him. Centurions always led from the front and held their ground. Centurions' motto was, "They shall not pass." As much as any legionary, they knew how to fight at close quarters, but perhaps fighting a gladiator was not something that they had in mind. Spartacus's fate survives only in legend. In the end, according to one account, with those around him either have been killed or fled, Spartacus stood his ground, surrounded by many, and although he defended himself, he was cut down. And by killing Spartacus, the Romans had turned the tables of his strategy of trying to get to Crassus, of which Spartacus was never able to do. They inflicted the psychological shock on his men that Spartacus had hoped to inflict on the Romans. After he was killed, the rest of the army fell into disorder. The loss of cohesion is fatal in a pitched battle like this. The legionaries, we can imagine, now pushed and chopped their way into the rebel lines, opening up pockets here and everywhere. The bravest of the rebels would have stayed and fought, but many would have simply run if they still could. They were cut down in mass, says one source. They met with a death worthy of real men. Somewhere between the headwaters of the Salaris and the spot where the river breaks out of the mountains into the plain, somewhere along the ancient highway between Italy's two seas, somewhere between the road to Sinae and the beaches where the Allies would land one day, Spartacus was laid to rest. Spartacus was killed, following his sacred oath to stand erect and die to iron, to die invincible. And here he is, invincible in the minds of men 2,000 years later. His story carries on in the heart of every underdog from time innumerable. What a fucking story. The man with the brass balls, the scourge of Rome. What a fucking way to go out. And that is my cue to get out as well. There's a little bit more to this story afterward that involves Crassus, but this isn't a podcast about that shit. This is about slavery, and this is the end of the Third Servile War. Going forward, the podcast will come a bit slower. I have started a part-time job to help pay the bills. My wife, bless her, let me try and get this podcast going, and I haven't made any dollar bills from it yet. That's okay for me, but to help, I needed to go find a job. And this podcast won't stop. In the meantime, I just wanted to let you guys know, as I said before, that it's probably going to be a little bit slower. I'd like to do it every other week. Maybe I'll do shorter episodes or something. I've tried that in the past. I'm just really bad at it. I just have trouble leaving things out. And I left a lot out of this, too. Perhaps you guys can tell me what you think that I should do, or maybe do a longer episode one week, and then the second week I do a shorter episode. I don't know. You guys let me know what you're thinking. As always, I will put my information, my contact information in the information section of the podcast in the description. My email, contact@historyuncensoredpod.com, as well as my Twitter, Seth at Seth4Nerds, Seth the number 4 nerds. And you guys can reach out to me. But seriously, you guys are the fucking best. I appreciate every single person that listens to this podcast, and I look forward to bringing you content for years to come. For now, though, it must slow down. I appreciate the patience with this episode as well, as like I said, this is the third time I tried to record it. What a Spartacus, you bitch. It was the worst. Finally getting this episode done. My next episode, I will be getting back to the history of women, introducing Theodora, the prostitute of Rome. I can't wait. But if you like the show, please rate and review me on iTunes or wherever you can. Send me an email with topics or just things that you want to discuss, or just reach out to me to say, hey, send me history questions, personal questions, or anything else you would like to hear me talk about. I enjoy nothing more than your reflections and thoughts, and I legit read everything sent to me. No kidding. Literally read everything sent to me. My contact will be there. As always, history remembers. And this has been Seth Michaels with another episode of History Uncensored.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.